Thank you so much for having me here. So when I started, my let's say my adventure in this topic, it was when back in Ecuador, my brother, he suffers from OCD. He's playing the drums there. I'm playing the keyboard. And we enjoyed many good moments, but also a lot of difficulties and harsh moments because of his hard to detect, hard to manage, hard to provide good support. Everything that you will imagine in mental health, sadly, applied to him, and he even today hasn't received the right type of treatment, and it was too late, and all the sad stories. So I wanted to do something about it. And part of the inspiration for technology was that when we were doing CBT, I was able to bring him to do some cognitive behavioral therapy in the U.S. He was playing this little game. He was supposed to use the phone to like follow alarms and do things, but he liked playing games. And he basically said that this little game was really useful for him to reduce anxiety. So I wanted to see if technology can do more than that. But sadly, the story repeats itself over and over and over again. Like if you see, like 1/4 of the population has some kind of mental health related issue or neurological issue, but only like about 10% of this population is referred to a proper care. From that 10%, about 20% get properly diagnosed. From that 20%, only 1/3 kind of completes treatment and gets better. And from that 1/3, only like 1/3 does not relapse. So if you look at the mental health problem from an efficiency perspective, it's really bad. Like we have a really unsolved problem. And this is not just a problem from a health perspective. For me, it's a problem of science, engineering, and design, and really trying to come together to design things that are not just efficacious but also engaging. So I basically, for the past few years, I left my business career. Before being a scientist, I was in business doing like strategy and product development. And I wanted to do stress management technology. I work at Berkeley and Stanford in computer science, developing some of these ideas. And more recently, I've been involved with these ideas of precision health and well-being at the med school here at Stanford, learning, how to think from a health perspective. And I would say part of the lesson is that we really need an overhaul on the way that we think about health, and I'm not sure where it should come from. From engineering, perhaps, is actually better positioned than even the health sciences in for some regards, and we can talk about that, later if you want. And the main reason that I say that is because if you look at the definition of health in its entirety, involves this notion of well-being, and this is defined by the World Health Organization. And sadly, this whole part of like physical, mental, and social well-being, it's like a tiny portion of what our health system focuses on. It's our health system focuses mostly on the second part, which is the absence of disease or infirmity, or fixing disease and infirmity. So there's a tremendous imbalance in how people focuses in the health sciences, more on the sickness aspect and not so much on the let's not get sick aspect. So for me, well-being, even though it's a complicated topic, which involves all these different elements like stress, mobility, nutrition, etc., is where we should put our attention and try to work. It's really more in a behavioral challenge. It's about lifestyles. It's not so much about like chess biology. Of course, biology plays a role too, and economics even. And more recently, from my end, I've been focusing mostly on stress management, which is what I know better, and a little bit of mobility and exercise, and that's what I'm going to share in this talk. So, in terms of stress management, one of the ways of thinking about stress is, why stress exists, and it's actually fundamental for survival. The behavior of mammals under stress is to move. They actually run, and that's what they do. Like, they don't have venoms or spines or things like that. They just move fast to try to be not eaten or eat. And that's what Sapolsky has been like proposing, that, stress is normal and it regulates itself. Yerkes Dodson actually has extended some of the notions of stress, saying like Stress actually has some kind of like optimal function for performance. Too much stress is not great for you. Too little stress is also not great for you, because then that means that you don't run and the lion just eats the zebra. You have to run, right? And finally, McEwen's allostatic load observations in the recent years has been also be very important, because they showed us that stress is a cumulative function, and if you don't regulate stress properly, eventually will actually eat you alive. Like, you will have some kind of like problems in your autoimmune function even. Now, one of the challenges of stress for movement is that you need some infrastructure to move, right? And that's actually a very important thing. Like this zebra without the prairie will not be able to run. So you need to have a place to run. You need to have that opportunity to do stuff and move. And sadly, if you look at the current trends in how humans behave, we have the beautiful body to move. Look at our arms and legs, but look at what we keep doing, like 93% of the time. You want to find a human, you don't find them in prairies anymore, you find them in chairs, right? There's where they exist nowadays. Or cars. So sadly, it's a challenge, and it's a staggering amount of time that we spend indoors. So I'm very interested on this challenge. Like, of course, we should get people doing more exercise, and that's a great approach. But we also should find ways to intervene in this modern wild. That's what I call, everyday stress management in the modern wild. And how to use sensors and interventions, like a closed loop system, to help people manage these challenges. That's what I've been trying to focus on during my career. So I will want some examples of these are, imagine if we can use existing popular apps or games or chatbots as micro interventions for stress management in the wild. Imagine if that's possible, or imagine if our infrastructure, our mouse or our everyday devices can be sensors. We don't have to have special kind of sensors. Or what if we can use our cars as sensors again, or use them also as maybe breathing guidance, or perhaps even use our desks as a means to help us move more and help regulate stress and also reduce sedentarism. So these are some of the ideas of what I've been working on for the past 10, 12 years. And they are work across multiple domains. I have published work related to workplaces, work also related to the commute, which is a very interesting part of life, and where we can spend a lot of good effort trying to regulate stress, and in life in general. So as you can see, publications both in computer science, CHI, and HCI community, but also in journals like JMIR and other journals for medical applications. Of course, my interest goes not just separate silos, but the interplay between these different areas is quite important. The type of work that I do, for those who may not be familiar with how HCI frames, it's based basically on human-centered design to identify basically the needs from users, and then a combination with the scientific method to validate the ideas and try to find this efficacious, engaging, and ethical sweet spot where we can create technology that's actually valuable and impactful. Furthermore, I add some flavor with applied machine learning to try to do prediction, and I use it as a tool constantly. And I am always challenging myself and my team to focus on implementation in the wild. How will our tools escalate? For those of you who know me, that you will know that I'm less prone to putting a lot of things in people's bodies, and rather putting nothing and just working with what we already have if possible. So I'm going to tell you two stories during the rest of the talk. One is about sensing and what I call sensorless sensing, and I will explain that in a second, where I will show you how I use the mouse as a sensor and how that evolved towards the trackpad as a sensor, or the steering wheel as a sensor in a car, and more recently how we implemented that actually in the wild in a real implementation. So part of the tenure of my talk is like how we go from the lab in the wild also by understanding different, one step at a time, the challenges of getting out of the lab. And the other story is this just-in-time peripheral interventions and peripheral interventions where we will have like some just-in-time paradigms applied for the mobile phones and how those evolve into browser and chatbot projects, and tell you a little bit on how I have been thinking about peripheral interventions specifically on breathing regulation. As I said, we have two parts, the talk, the research agenda, and then the future research, and we'll have a break in between. So let's just get through it. So the research part is about these two things, sensorless sensing and just-in-time. Let's look at the first one, sensorless sensing. So sensorless sensing, basically, the way that I define it is like, how do we repurpose continuous data from everyday devices, from mouse, steering wheel, phone, etc., and complement the wearable paradigm, right? Complement. I think wearables have a lot of benefits, but they also have these drawbacks, which is like high dropout without accomplishing behavior change. And that doesn't happen because people don't like the wearable. It's because they forgot to charge it, or it's just the battery. You haven't used it for a while. I just was trying to use my Ring, like I have a Ring, and the battery is dead, and now it's working because I stopped using it for like a month or something, and now it's been 6 months since I used last time my Ring, my sleep Ring. So the problem with wearables is not that they don't work, is that people stop using them for some way or another. So how do I approach this sensorless sensing? There's many ways of approaching it, but for the stress challenge, I was very interested in this notion of like, how do we measure stress? And we know that stress is basically uses the peripheral nervous system which is a supplement to the central nervous system in the brain. Of course, there's a lot of effects in the central nervous system, but the peripheral nervous system is the one that actually shows all the activity or the action that needs to be produced because of stress. And it is actually one piece of that peripheral nervous system that's called the autonomic nervous system that regulates digestion, vision, etc., that has a tremendous impact by stress. You have focused view, and you stop digesting, and a bunch of other things that you need to do in order to survive. And there's several measurements that psychophysiology has been using for the past century, from skin conductivity and heart rate variability, and even cortisol, as measurement for stress. And I have some experience with all of them. But the part that hasn't been studied that much is this other part of the peripheral nervous system called the somatic nervous system, which actually focuses on stability and posture and movement. And you can get measurements of that with wearables as well, like EMG. But you can also get an indirect or distal assessment of these measurements through movement, because movement is the expression of the somatic nervous system. So if you can get the movement, you could potentially do some kind of reverse engineering and do inference of what's happening with that nervous system. And that's what I've been trying to do. So for example, we've been looking at PC mouse displacement. How does this differ when you're stressed versus when you're not stressed? So you can see here two traces of two participants who were calm and did the same exact tasks under being a calm condition versus a stress condition. As you can see, participant A seems easy to find some kind of function to determine the differences between the two, but participant B is pretty hard, right? It's not obvious just from the traces. These traces are the X displacement when they are moving their hand. So what we wanted to do is what if we can model these by using some kind of concrete modeling where we can actually assume that the perhaps hand or an arm can be seen as a mass spring damper. So it's a biomechanical model. And this mass spring damper has a dynamic function, and one of the factors of the dynamic function is the K coefficient, which basically indicates the amount of, it's called the spring constant of this dynamic function, and it's correlated with muscle stiffness. And we used a specific value from the model called the damping frequency, or omega, to try to estimate that. And we formulated a hypothesis that we said, this omega should be higher under stress as compared to a baseline. So we had to estimate that baseline and then try to see if it's true. And the first experiment that we basically work and we did this assessment using inverse filtering, we were able to prove that under doing the exact same tasks, but under stress and baseline, we were able to actually get this difference. And that was very exciting. So that was the triggering first study that basically put me on the trajectory of keep studying movement as part of this sensorless sensing. After that, I started getting a bit more in depth, and I wanted to understand, well, what happens if we use different type of movement like the trackpad. And the interesting challenge of the trackpad is that, in contrast with the mouse that basically uses the big muscles of your upper arm that get all tense because of stress, the trackpad uses mostly ligaments and little muscles of the lower part of your arm, which are less aroused or less tense, or let's say the signal of tension is harder to obtain. So, but we still wanted to see the difference. So we ran the same experiment that we did with the mouse earlier, and we observed that under the same conditions which we used for the mouse, which were point and click steering and drag and drop, we basically had a different reaction. We again applied the same stressor, the same baseline. The stressor, for those of you who are curious, were recursive subtraction. This is a well-tested type of stressor where you ask people to subtract numbers, in front of the researcher, and that basically arouses people. And the baseline was a soothing video. So we applied all these canonical movements, and eventually we didn't observe the same reaction that we saw in the mouse, but we did observe that another measurement appeared as a predictor of stress, which was the pressure, or in this case, an approximation of pressure, which is the area under the finger, as a predictor of stress in the trackpad, which was pretty exciting and interesting. So ultimately, what we learned from this experience of running two experiments with the same format in two different input devices, that in the mouse you have the larger muscles and displacement plays a role, and the trackpad, smaller hand muscles, pressure played a bigger role. We then extended this idea even to a different modality. We basically said, well, what if we can look at the car as an input device, the steering wheel more specifically, where you can get the turns measured in degrees, and we wanted to apply the same format that we've been studying. We did a simulated control experiment, again with the stressor, which was subtraction, and the pre-task stressor, the subtraction. But in this case, we applied also a stressor during the task, which was listening to heavy metal music. And this was not just our idea. This is documentation that heavy metal in general is very stressful. Some people love heavy metal, and I do enjoy some heavy metal. But on average, people get stressed with heavy metal while driving. Let's put it that way, which worked really well. And the reason we did this is because in the mouse case, it's very easy to have a lot of clicks, but in driving, you cannot just be driving like crazy and just going one way or another. So you have to keep them stressed for longer. Anyway, so this was a funny, very interesting experiment. Let's put it that way. Proposed the same hypothesis. In this case, we extracted the trajectory from the beginning of the movement. We had to do turn segmentation from each of the turns that they did, and we basically took the first part of the movement. Since this is a circular movement, you have some inertia that builds up over time, so we only extracted the first part of the movement to try to avoid some mechanical artifacts there. And we wanted to do the same K-constant estimation that we used before. We applied an inverse coding technique called linear predictive coding, and we tried to infer the mass spring damper. For those who know signal processing, this is basically an autocorrelation inverse filtering technique that's highly used in speech synthesis or speech detection. And you basically try to estimate the future samples based on the current observations of data, and that helped us estimate based, on this approximation. It helped us estimate the damping frequency. I'm not going to get in all the technical details, but I'm more than happy to if you want me to. It has a lot to do with control theory and finding the dominant poles, and those are the determinants of the muscle tension. Again, we detected that damping frequency was quite obviously higher over stress as compared with stress driving. And we actually were very happy to see that even with just the first 8 turns, we don't need to wait and to collect all the 10 minutes of data. Basically, in about a minute and 8 turns, we already had enough data to generate a result. More recently and more excitingly, we actually just got this publication on showing that this actually worked beyond the simulator. And we actually observed this in a real car being driven by real people. We created a lab in this, in this parking lot at Stanford, and this was literally our lab for months. Working in this garage, driving cars with people signing waivers for those who, in case they get in an accident or something. Thank God, never happened anything. The good thing is that we learned a lot about how to do research. In a parsimonious way, going from theory, in the mouse, then going into the simulator, and finally getting in the wild to make sure that, we understand the phenomena of stress. And we again proved that this is possible in the wild. So this is the story of sensorless sensing. I told you about the mouse and the trackpad and the steering wheel, and how recently we also proved that it's possible to do it in a real vehicle beyond the simulator. Some of the insights of this part is it's interesting to see the compliance. There's no dropout versus wearables. It's affordable. It's just software, and there's a multi-domain coverage. We can have billions of devices. At work, a car, home. These are PC mouse that you can get in Walmart. These are not special mouse. Or the special cards or anything. These are the things that are in the wild. And the hope is that, we can use this to apply it to the real world, change this paradigm of one visit per year to the doctor, and actually simulate more the jet engine or the aerospace industry, where humans actually have this continuous monitoring to do precision health. And the great thing is that, in the wild, you have, all these devices that you can get. You can work around issues like burnout, that is very prevalent in many populations, anxiety with teens doom scrolling or procrastination, or even game toxicity, because we can apply movement inference also for joysticks or any of these other types of devices. I'm actually right now working with the Navy. They want us to look at the helicopter joystick as an input for stress, and try to use that to determine some elements there too. The second part is this interventions piece. Second part of the second component of the research agenda is the intervention piece, which closes the loop. It's you're doing all this sensing, then what do you do for interventions? And I'm gonna tell you a little bit about a project on personalized just-in-time interventions for mobile phone, and how that evolved to the browser, and a little bit about the first work I've been doing on breathing regulation as well as a peripheral intervention. And after that, I'll stop for some questions. So one of the challenges with interventions is that healthy people have very low motivation to stay healthy. Sadly, it is when they get sick that they want to be healthy, because that's what drives health interest. Sadly, it's like that. So if you want to keep healthy people healthy, you have to think on how to develop these healthy skills and habits, and that demands having engaging personalized just-in-time or peripheral interventions, some other ways of thinking. There's other paradigms too, and there's changes of culture and hygiene thinking, but this is one of the proposals that I make, these just-in-time peripheral interventions. So the just-in-time paradigm, one of the research that we did when I was in Microsoft Research as an intern was, looking at, how can we use, things that you already know how to use, Facebook or Pinterest or whatever as interventions, and use machine learning to basically tell you what to do when the moment comes. Based on your ratings, you will essentially get like an optimized function with recommendation algorithms and try to pick the right type of intervention. So basically we ask, can we repurpose this popular media into microinterventions? And then can we actually automatically detect what are the policies or the recommendation to match the interventions to your personal states? And finally, can we actually adopt adaptive coping strategies over time? Because ultimately the real challenge is coping. It's not so much as doing interventions, like learning to cope, right? Learning to find the right mechanisms, which is basically going from this idea of maladaptive coping into adaptive coping, adopting good techniques. So we wanted to design interventions that will help people adopt better coping, and we wanted to measure the coping trajectory to see how things go in this research. So for us to design these interventions that help cope and which will be engaging and efficacious, we basically intersected what people already do, very popular media, the top 10 applications in different areas, and we intersected that with proven therapies that already are quite popular also in the treatment of stress. And we designed very simple interventions that had basically a prompt and a URL, a prompt that says, go to this place and do something specifically. So for example, for positive psychology, to give an example, there's this technique called 3 Good Things. We basically have a prompt that says, time goes by so fast, find a moment in your Facebook timeline. So it prompts you to do something specifically in the Facebook timeline, not just go to the timeline, but go and find a good moment of memory. And we basically gave them the access directly to the Facebook system. This was a browser-based application that we developed. And so they weren't there, applied the intervention, and then they came back and rated. Another example is for somatic. We had getting people to laugh. So we prompt them to go and see something funny in Pinterest in this case, and we basically send them to the link. And then after that, they will rate their intervention. So again, the mechanics were not designed by us. They already know how to use Pinterest. They already know how to use Facebook. We just prompted them to do something specifically with that. In order to personalize the use of these interventions, we use a technique called contextual multivariate bandits from machine learning, or reinforcement learning more specifically, which is based on the paradigm of exploration and exploitation. You explore first all these different interventions that we created. We created several micro interventions, and then once you start finding which work better, and this is all automatically done, you start exploiting them. So essentially, we had an action space that has these 16 types of interventions or arms from the contextual multivariate bandits, from different techniques: positive psychology, cognitive behavioral, metacognitive, somatic. We use what's called the state space as contextual information, both sensors and user data from the phone in order to extract. We got 84 features that we used to train the algorithm. And the reward function was essentially a self-reported stress. In this case, we could have used at some point, or we could in the future use a different reward function, maybe more automatic, like a sensor or wearable, or even the displacement sensors that I mentioned earlier. But that's something that we didn't apply here because they weren't precise enough yet. So we ran a longitudinal experiment where we compared the random condition, random recommendations versus the machine learning conditions with the contextual multivariate bandits. And we also wanted to compare what happens if people are able to override the recommendations from the system versus not able to override the recommendations. We had thousands of interventions over the course of a month. The results were very encouraging. The machine learning with no override had the best average stress reduction over time. Pretty much in every day, this condition was the one that gave the highest amount of stress reduction. Like I'm talking that specific reduction per intervention as compared to the other condition. But beyond just the specific reduction over time, coping was what we were really interested. We observed that the same condition had the best movement in the coping assessment. People in that condition were started to use more these adaptive mechanisms of coping as opposed to the maladaptive ones that were prevalent before. Sorry for that mishap in the intervention. If you look at the how the data from the algorithm look like, we actually observe that, as you can see, each of these columns represent a participant, and each of the participants have different combinations of positive psychology, CBT, metacognitive, somatic. Again, this was automatically detected by the contextual Moltarian bandit. And I think one very interesting observation here is that, they weren't obviously like uniformly distributed. And on average, CBT, which is supposed to be, the ultimate way of treating, these kind of issues, wasn't the one that really people really like the most. And from a qualitative perspective, some of the ways that we got to think about it is that people see CBT a little bit like homework. And for this micro intervention format, they didn't appreciate that need of like having to like really think too much and set time aside to cope. So that doesn't mean that CBT doesn't work. I'm just saying that this bite-sized format might be better served with other types of techniques, and maybe once they develop more coping mechanism, they could engage into like stronger like CBT therapy if needed. I hope that the people that won't need it, right? That's the actual objective, right? The people just can live life without having to go to therapy. The other observation that I think is important to see here is that, and beware the y-axis here, is that, for those who were able to override versus not override, at the beginning, people started in the machine learning conditions started to accept better or less override the type of like interventions that they received, but then after week 2, they started again like looking for new interventions as opposed to like just using the supposedly good interventions that the algorithm discovered. And one of the very interesting insights from this participant was that I'm bored with the same apps, right? Deep breathing stretches and I hate cats, right? So please like stop doing this to me. Like, give me something else. Like, at the end of the day, I think this is one of the real complex challenges, like more than the algorithmic aspect. It's like, how do we keep the content fresh? And not only that, there was a paradoxical reaction to this experiment, right? 34% of the people were aware that, stress is stressful, and they actually quit the application earlier. Some of them didn't do anything, because they didn't know what to do, or they just kept doing the traditional coping. And only a few of these 34% of the people who said like being aware of stress is stressful actually benefited from the app. So some people say basically the app is causing me to think about it, and that's stressing me up. So that's the other big challenge. Like, stress is not like temperature that you just lower or increase temperature to regulate. Stress, you sometimes mean well to try to reduce stress and say, hey, don't worry about it, and you actually get people more worried. Like those who deal with OCD, like my brother, you tell them don't to worry, and then that's way worse than just like not doing anything. So once you say don't worry about it, that, oh my God, they start worrying more. So you have to, that's a challenge a little bit with the stress. But more recently, we've been looking also at the data and trying to understand, well, what kind of features were useful to actually like train this algorithm? What things should we obtain? Because we cannot be measuring the hell out of everything from the phone. So if you observe the top 10 variables that influence stress, they are related to like, the assessment of stress before the intervention, some personality issues, some like demographic information, and some circumstantial information that will give us some enough information like affective data, personality, demographics, time and place data are quite correlated with the maximization of reward. This was done with a technique called the Gini coefficient evaluation of the features. if you want to understand how much data do we need to train, because that's another important question. Well, how many trials do we need to have? We ran several simulations of different type, what's called offline policy analysis, several simulations of these bandits on the data that we had. And we observed that, you need about 200 to 300 data points in order to get the algorithms to outperform a random function, a random assignment of interventions to get better rewards. That doesn't sound like a lot of data that you need to train. If you have like enough participants, you might get them in a day or so. But the true challenge is that, for me, is this what I call the first impression effect. Like one early, bad intervention actually might trigger that people never return to the system. So we have to be very careful with that kind of problem. If you ask which features actually lead to adherence, we ran a generalized linear model and tried to observe the frequency of use of the future based on the variables of today. We again observe very interesting trends that, affect has an effect on or self-assessment of affect. Time, again, personality and demographics play a role on the future. And that's actually pretty good. We also observed that, there is an importance from the frequency of use. The frequency of use determines more frequency of use. So there's some kind of like snowballing effect. And if you look at some kind of measurement of entropy, meaning the variety of the types of interventions that they observe, they also seem to have an effect. And so that means that exposure to different things do have an effect also in how they may use the system in the future. So anyways, these are some of the things that we learned from that system. Based on that, we built a different modality. I just want to show we're actually in the process of collecting the data. We created a Chrome plugin that has microinterventions, and it's basically embedded in Google Chrome, and you can have different interventions, like in this case, go translate something instead of wasting your time, procrastinating. We call it the Home Suite Office. We combine stress management and also procrastination interventions. We use the same algorithms, the contextual multi-arm bandits, and we're actually right now in the process of getting all that data. We also tested the similar context, similar idea of these microinterventions with chatbots. We wanted to see if chatbots can be used as microinterventions. We call them shallow or micro chatbots. We created chatbots that represented each of the different techniques, similar to what I mentioned earlier, techniques for positive thinking, for problem solving, from different families of therapy. And we created this system in Telegram to try to get students and admins from the university to actually test it and see if these micro chatbots will have a benefit. We observed that people were very interested in the techniques. They didn't like the NLP challenges of chatbots, and that's actually the bigger problem. It's sometimes it's not the intervention itself that threw them off. It's like the NLP not being perfectly smooth. So as things get better now with GPT-3, etc., this helps a little bit. So we did observe reduction in stress over time, self-assessed reduction of stress over time, especially among those who use chatbots quite a bit. And the most interesting part of the chatbots is that they actually wanted these chatbots. They said, we want these chatbots because we want to have these micro conversations with something else than a human, because humans are very complicated creatures. We have to say hi, you have to look at them nicely. If you don't talk in some way, then they actually don't talk to you back. So chatbots don't have those problems. Let's just talk to me, right? And they give me information, and they are useful. And they said, basically we want something that looks like a human, but it's not a human, right? So they are not looking for human replacements. They are not replace my therapist. We want these different creatures, and that's why we believe that there's a space for an ecosystem of micro chatbots and humans in the future. Okay, to close this interventions piece, I want to mention, briefly some of the work I've done in what I call peripheral interventions. Peripheral interventions is a different kind of intervention. This is not about micro just-in-time intervention. This is more like you're doing the task while and then you do the regulation or the intervention while doing the task, so you don't have to stop. The other ones you have to stop doing the task. Here you don't. You just, for example, in this case, keep driving and you try to see if it's useful. We use driving because people don't have time, and the commute is actually a great moment for people to do these kind of things. And there's millions and millions of people driving, and sadly we're back to driving again now that we're getting off the pandemic and people spend millions of hours per day in cars. So we wanted to see what happens if we can actually get people breathing. I'm going to skip actually this theoretical piece because there's not going to be time. So we tested the guided breathing in a simulator first. Can we actually guide you to breathe with a haptic stimulus in your back in the chair? We observed that it worked really well. The breathing was reduced and was sustained even after removing the stimulus. And we even got people in the autonomous driving condition falling asleep, which is actually very interesting. I was telling my colleagues from Toyota, I'm like, we want to do this guided breathing in autonomous vehicles. I'm like, be careful because they might sleep, and then unless you have a perfect car, level 5 or whatever, you might be killing people instead of helping them to sleep forever. So be careful in getting people too relaxed when you're in autonomous driving. But it works really well. And we even proved that it worked in a real car. We just recently published this. We got the car instrumented with a mat that has all the haptic stimulus here embedded, all the motors that generate the signal for people to feel the guided breathing in the back. And we were able to basically have a reduction of breathing and a reduction of HRV. This is a different experiment than the one you saw for stress in the same lab in the garage, but a different experiment. And again, we were able to show that we can intervene without having an effect in performance. We actually measure performance by looking at the deviation of the car, and we measure the deviation of the car with some camera and computer vision, and also with car braking, and we didn't observe any safety issues with this peripheral thing. So we observed that we can do guided breathing without really having an effect. So in summary, I've shown you about these just-in-time interventions and the insights. The insights of these just-in-time peripheral interventions are that they're lower barrier of entry because we repurpose things. They are personalized and contextualized, and we haven't seen damaging effects in the task. The applications are occupational health, many things in occupational health, education even, if you want to regulate stress. And one of the challenges, though, of these just-in-time interventions is that if we want to implement them in the wild, they will be competing with other attention-grabbing media. Right, that's a challenge. They will be competing with it. So now, how do we position them such that people actually do this instead of just looking at Facebook or TikTok or whatever, right? The good thing is that they are implementable in the wild in many ways. End user applications for productivity, etc. Let's just get here. Just to close this part one, I wanted to say a couple of things on the reflections. The interventions are not an evolution of sensing. So just because we're doing sensing doesn't mean that we know how to do interventions, especially in stress. So we need to invest time on intervention research. Engagement is not an evolution of precision. Just because the sensors are precise, that doesn't mean that people will be engaged. You need to know how to engage people. And efficiency is not an evolution of efficacy. Just because you can get something to work doesn't mean that everybody is going to be using it. So you have to think also widely how to do these things. This is a micro interlude. If you have any questions, we can do it. But I think I took way longer than I expected. So maybe we can even stop here.